In a bold move sending shockwaves across the global media landscape, Burkina Faso's transitional president, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, has officially banned two major Western media outlets, BBC and France24, from operating within the country's borders. The decision, made public early Friday morning, is being hailed by many across West Africa as a long overdue act of sovereignty and, by others in the West, as a dangerous sign of media suppression. But behind the headlines lies a deeper narrative, one that stretches across decades of post-independence struggle, neo-colonial tensions, and the rise of a new generation of African leaders unafraid to confront the institutions that once claimed to report objective truth. Ibrahim Traoré, a 36-year-old military officer turned political revolutionary, rose to power in September 2022 following a military coup that ousted the transitional government of Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba. At the time, Burkina Faso was on the verge of collapse, torn apart by terrorist insurgencies, economic collapse, and growing distrust of foreign forces, particularly French military presence, which many Burkinabe accused of worsening insecurity rather than resolving it. Traoré's rise was seen not just as a change in leadership, but as the beginning of a larger movement, a West African revolution against foreign domination, both military and ideological. In the nearly 3 years since he assumed power, Traoré has been anything but silent. He has spoken passionately about African unity, economic independence, and the urgent need for African nations to take full control of their resources, narratives, and destinies. And now, his government says, it is time to reclaim the African narrative from the media arms of neocolonialism. The Accusation, a campaign of disinformation. In a 10-page statement issued by Burkina Faso's Ministry of Communication and Digital Transformation, the government accuses BBC and France24 of launching a coordinated media assault against the Burkinabe state and its leadership. The statement cites more than 24 reports published between 2023 and 2025, which, according to officials, deliberately misrepresent the security situation, fabricate human rights abuses, and portray President Traoré as a militaristic dictator rather than the liberationist he is. These media outlets have become agents of destabilization, not information, the statement reads. They echo the voices of foreign governments and intelligence agencies more than they reflect the realities of our people. Their goal is to tarnish the image of leaders who reject Western control. One particular grievance cited in the report is a France24 segment aired in April 2025, which described the Burkinabe military's operations in the Sahel as brutal and lacking accountability, while providing no mention of the extensive community outreach, rebuilding programs, and security victories achieved under Traoré's leadership. Another BBC World News report questioned the legitimacy of the joint anti-terrorist alliance formed between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, suggesting the three countries were isolating themselves from the international community and endangering their populations. To these portrayals, a senior government advisor responded bluntly, "What they call isolation, we call sovereignty, media colonialism, a battle over the African mind." The issue, according to many in Traoré's administration, goes beyond any single news report. It is about control of the African story. The West no longer rules Africa with guns and chains, said Dr. Malik Serey, a political science professor at the University of Ouagadougou. They rule with narratives. They tell the world that we are failing states, that our leaders are tyrants, that we can't govern ourselves. And the tools they use are the very media institutions they fund and protect. This sentiment is echoed across Burkina Faso's capital. In public forums, on radio call-in shows, and across social media, young Burkinabe are openly challenging what they call media imperialism. "This is not about press freedom, this is about truth," said Aminata Coulibaly, a 28-year-old activist from Bobo Dioulasso. BBC and France 24 have never told our story from our perspective. They parachute in white journalists to interview scared villagers and claim to know our reality. But they do not live here. They do not fight our battles. The bigger picture. A continental shift. Burkina Faso is not alone in its media crackdown. In 2023, neighboring Mali expelled Radio France Internationale and France 24 for similar reasons. Niger, under the leadership of the National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland, CNSP, followed suit in 2024, blocking multiple Western media platforms after accusing them of supporting terrorist narratives. Analysts say the trend signals a major ideological shift in the Sahel, a region long dominated by French influence but now increasingly looking inward and eastward, forging new alliances with nations like Russia, Turkey, and China. Western governments are losing their grip on the Sahel, said Nigerian journalist and media watchdog Omoyele Ayodele. And the media is the last weapon in their arsenal. But even that is failing because people are waking up. They are asking, who benefits from these stories? Who writes them? And why do they always serve the same powers? As part of the ban, all BBC and France 24 journalists have been given 48 hours to vacate Burkina Faso. Any future reporting from within the country by these organizations will be considered a violation of national sovereignty and may result in prosecution, officials warn. Local media are being encouraged to rise to the occasion, with the government pledging increased funding for community-based journalism, training programs, and public broadcasting initiatives free from foreign influence. Meanwhile, President Traoré remains defiant. In a speech delivered to a crowd of thousands outside the National Assembly, he declared, "They want to define us. They want to label our resistance as dictatorship, our pride as aggression, and our truth as lies. But the African lion has awakened. No foreign tongue will ever again tell our story better than we can." While human rights organizations and press freedom groups like Reporters Without Borders have condemned the ban, the mood inside Burkina Faso tells a different story. For many citizens, this is not an attack on the press. It is a defense of dignity. "This is the first time in my life I have seen a president stand up to the West without fear," said Suleimana Nikiema, a 63-year-old retired teacher. They may call him a rebel, but to us, he is a liberator. The battle between narrative and nationhood has now entered a new phase in West Africa. And as the winds of change continue to sweep through the Sahel, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. Africa is no longer begging for a voice. It is taking the microphone back. The decision by President Ibrahim Traoré to expel BBC and France 24 has ignited fierce debate in international circles. Western governments and institutions have been quick to condemn the move, calling it a dangerous suppression of press freedom and warning that such actions could isolate Burkina Faso diplomatically. The French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs released a statement within hours of the announcement, describing the media ban as yet another blow to democratic governance and transparency in the Sahel. The United Kingdom's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office echoed these sentiments, stating that a free press is essential for stability and accountability, especially in regions facing security challenges. However, these condemnations have been met with deep skepticism by many African observers. How can nations that control 90% of the global media infrastructure lecture us about press freedom? Asked Adama Gassama, an investigative journalist based in Senegal. For years, African voices have been marginalized in global conversations. When our leaders challenge the status quo, they are immediately painted as threats to democracy. But who defines democracy? Who funds the news? In several African capitals, especially in countries where anti-French sentiment has grown, Traoré's move has sparked admiration. Rallies in Bamako, Mali, and Niamey, Niger, have seen citizens waving Burkina Faso flags, chanting slogans like "Africa for Africans" and "Down with Media Colonialism." A history of media manipulation in Africa. To understand the gravity of Traoré's actions, one must revisit the long and complicated relationship between Western media and African leadership. During the Cold War, African leaders who aligned with the West were praised in the press, even when they oversaw authoritarian regimes. Those who pursued socialist or pan-Africanist policies, however, were often portrayed as dangerous radicals or Soviet puppets. The case of Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader from 1983 to 1987, is perhaps the most glaring example. Despite his popular domestic policies, land reform, vaccination programs, anti-corruption campaigns, Western media repeatedly described Sankara as unstable, militaristic, and a Marxist threat. Today, President Traoré invokes Sankara's legacy frequently, referring to him as the unbroken spirit of African resistance. The similarities are striking. Both rose to power as young military officers, both rejected IMF and World Bank dependency, and both called out foreign powers for exploiting Africa. But while Sankara was assassinated in 1987 under suspicious circumstances widely believed to involve foreign interests, Traoré has learned from history. "We are not afraid of death," Traoré said during a February 2025 Pan-African summit in Niamey. But this time, the revolution will not be televised by BBC or France 24. It will be written by African hands, filmed by African eyes, and told in African tongues. With BBC and France 24 out of the picture, what comes next for journalism inside Burkina Faso? The government has announced the creation of a National Media Independence Fund, NMIF, aimed at strengthening domestic journalism. The fund will support radio stations in rural areas, train investigative reporters, and invest in multilingual content that reaches all ethnic communities. "We are not banning truth," said Minister of Information Fatouma Zongo. "We are creating a platform where the truth is not filtered through the lens of a former colonizer." However, critics warn that without a strong framework to protect journalistic integrity, this initiative could lead to government propaganda dressed as public service. "What matters now is balance," said Dr. Ibrahim Dembele, a media ethics professor in Bamako. If Traoré wants to prove he is different, he must allow local journalists to ask hard questions, not just patriotic ones. To this end, some independent Burkinabe outlets, such as Radio Savane Libre and Le Véritable Peuple, have welcomed the opportunity to grow, but insist that they must not become government mouthpieces. "We supported the media ban because the foreign reports were misleading," said Bernadette Cabore, editor-in-chief of Le Véritable Peuple. "But we will also hold our own government accountable. Real independence is not just from France, but from fear." Observers believe that this is only the beginning. As Burkina Faso becomes more assertive, other Western media organizations such as Reuters, AFP, and the New York Times may also find themselves under scrutiny. Already senior advisors in Niger and Mali have indicated that their governments are reviewing media accreditations across the region. "This is not a regional trend," said Nigerian political analyst Tunde Ogundipe. "This is a continental reckoning. Africa is realizing that control of information is as critical as control of territory." Indeed, for decades, African conflicts have been narrated by outsiders. Images of child soldiers, famines, and corruption became the primary representation of a diverse and complex continent. President Traoré and his allies are now attempting to flip the script, not with censorship, they argue, but with reclamation. Whether one sees Traoré as a visionary or a populist, his actions have reignited the debate about African independence in the 21st century. Not just political or economic independence, but narrative independence. The question now is, can African nations develop a media ecosystem that is both free and fair, without falling into state-controlled messaging or propaganda? If they succeed, Traoré may be remembered not as a dictator, but as a disruptor of a centuries-old information order that too often cast Africa as voiceless. If they fail, critics fear the continent may enter a new era of controlled speech, this time not enforced by foreign empires, but by its own post-liberation elites. Still, many in Burkina Faso believe the risk is worth taking. As one university student scrawled on the wall outside the French embassy in Ouagadougou, "We are no longer subjects of foreign truth. We are authors of our own."